Good afternoon, everybody. This is Gary from Vigilant Software. Thank you very much for joining on this afternoon. With the meeting being open or invited out to nearly 60 people, we're just going to give it until about 10 past 2 this afternoon to allow everybody to join on as planned. I'm going to pop myself on mute during that time just so you don't pick up any background noise from our office. And obviously, I look forward to speaking to you all in the next 9 minutes. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Gary from Vigilant Software. Thank you very much for being patient for the last 10 minutes whilst we just allowed a couple of the last people to join on to this afternoon's webinar. The webinar, as the title has described, is a training session for our vsRisk software, which is going to assist organisations to run through their ISO 27001 accreditation. Now, the training webinar for today is going to last around 1 hour, where we'll then move on to any questions that are going to be raised throughout the webinar, no doubt. So just to go through, we're going to have a brief introduction to the product. We're then going to go through ISMS creation, risk assessment, control reviews, reports and dashboard, and then, as I just mentioned a second ago, any questions that are raised throughout the presentation. With questions, unfortunately, we don't receive an alert as we go through, so please bear in mind that will be the case when you do ask as we go through the presentation. So, an introduction. vsRisk is essentially an information security risk assessment tool created by an ISO 27001 group of experts. At the moment, it is a desktop tool that allows you to conduct an information security risk assessment quickly and easily. By the way I say at the moment, we are looking to make this more of a cloud-based solution if that's more of your choosing as we go further into the year of 2018. The tool itself is fully aligned with ISO 27001, and over time we will look to breathe a new lease of life into it with up-and-coming control sets as we go further into the year as well. The versions of vsRisk come in two different standards. So we've got our standalone version, which would be predominantly for a smaller organization where you'll have one person running through your overall risk assessment. Alternatively, we do offer this as a multi-user version where you can have up to 10 individuals within your organization simultaneously working on a shared risk assessment between the group. And how this would work is essentially you'd have your database, instead of being stored on a local machine, which would be the case for standalone, you'd have your database stored on a central SQL server. The point of having these two different versions is to help businesses of all sizes conduct information security risk assessments with ease. So, ISMS creation. As we go through the webinar, this is going to be a matter of going between two different screens, so I hope that this is going to present as it should do your end as well. So the screen that we're looking at now is running on a virtual machine, so there might be a small delay between what I'm clicking on and what I am speaking about, but I will do my best to try and keep them synced the best as possible. So the version that we have installed on our remote system at the moment is vsRisk Standalone. That's what we're going to run in the webinar based on the back of today. Any multi-user queries that you may raise throughout the presentation, we'll come back to you separately after the webinar, maybe later on this afternoon, if not tomorrow. So as the title just mentioned, we're going to go through a basic ISMS creation. As standard, vsRisk will come with one ISMS built into it, and as you feel your business may grow over time, or if you're working more as a consultant capacity, you may wish to have a number of ISMS accounts, maybe for individual subsidiaries of a larger business, or if you're again a consultant, you may be working on behalf of a number of different organizations. So to create an ISMS, it's very simple. We simply click on New ISMS, and it'll open up a new screen for us where we need to go through and start assigning its organization name, ISMS name, lead assessor, email, and then if we want to integrate with this with our own Active Directory, we can do so at the bottom here. So we're just going to create a very basic one for today. So our organization is going to be Vigilant Software, like so. The ISMS name, this can be different to the organization, and it could be if you're working as a larger business, you may have your overall organization name and then followed by the specific ISMS that you're currently working on. In our case, we're just going to keep it as Vigilant, we'll call it webinar for this afternoon. The next point down here will then be who you want to be your lead assessor. Now, you could just give this as a job title. Alternatively, you can give it as a specific name. So we're going to put it as my name for today, and then followed by my email address on here as well. Okay, below there, if we wanted to toggle on integrated security, with this being a remote system, it doesn't have access to our Active Directory, so it doesn't actually give me the option. So what you need to go through is give yourself a username, password, and then confirm the password. Please keep a note of this, as this will be your login credentials if you're not using integrated security, as I just mentioned. So we're just going to create a nice basic one for this afternoon. like so. Once we're happy with all of this information, we can then move on into which control set selection we want to be basing our risk assessment off of. Predominantly, the tool is focused mainly on ISO 27001, so that's the one we're going to be selecting for today. So we're just going to remove any of the additional ones built in and then hit next. Once we've chosen next, it will then take us into our management scales. This will be both for likelihood and impact. As standard, it will give you the full range. You'll be going all the way through the entire spectrum of 1 to 7. So you'll go from almost impossible to almost certain, and then finally an impact. Now, each one of these, you do have the ability to add additional context to these. For example, under impact, we're simply illustrating at the moment operational, so less than 1 day, anything between 1 and 3 days, 4 to 7, etc. You may also want to add on additional context like so. We can give this its additional title. So we may want to add on here maybe a financial impact to the business over time, and then we can modify these like so. So 100 to 300, etc., etc. You can also remove these, not set in stone, if you want to remove them at a later date or just modify them as you see fit. So we're going to leave it just as the standard 7x7 grid and then hit next, and this will bring us to our last step in ISMS creation. So on here, when we've selected next, it will take us into what our acceptance criteria is going to be. At the moment, we have simply acceptable and unacceptable, and as you can see on the right-hand side is going to be your set criteria score. You can use a risk calculation formula, and we'll come into that in a bit more detail as we go through some of the more in-depth settings of vsRisk itself. At the top here, like I mentioned, we're simply using acceptable or unacceptable. We can allow additional criteria by toggling this switch on. Select and add new criteria, and then choosing that new criteria range. So the example that we typically put in here is going to be something like disaster. We can then give it a different key tone, just so we can differentiate it quite easily from the others. And we can also modify the range, and this will go for the other areas as well, like so. So if you want to start really honing in on obviously what falls in within an acceptable, unacceptable, or disaster range, you can start minimizing these year on year to obviously make yourselves a lot more of a tighter ship over time. Below each one of these, where you've got the acceptable, unacceptable, and disaster titles, you can then give a description as to what you feel best describes that particular criteria within your range of impact and likelihood scales. Once we're happy with all of this information, we simply hit finish. It will return us back to our home page here. The new ISMS will then be created in just a second, and there we can see Vigilant Software as our organization name, and then that particular ISMS is called Vigilant Webinar. The rest of the risk assessment that we're going to be running through this afternoon is going to be based on the sample company. For people that have already been using vsRisk, you will see that the sample company has been pre-configured or built by our development team whilst creating the vsRisk platform, and essentially it gives you a nice building block to help understand or better create your own ISMS from scratch if you're new to running a risk assessment within your business. The sample company, we do find with new starters to ISO 27001 or just risk assessments in general, has the ability to be copied. So you could clone the sample company, simply rename it to be something like Vigilant Software, and then you can use that as your building block, just making small modifications and tweaks where you feel necessary. Along the bottom here, you've got the option to export ISMS. Now, this could be quite handy if you're, say, a consultant and you also know that your client has vsRisk. You can export an ISMS, they can import it, and then they can continue on work that you would have completed on their behalf, and vice versa over time. Next to there, you can reset. So whilst it looks like a bin icon, which you'd normally associate with removing an ISMS, this simply resets all of the impact and likelihood scales, as well as any of the other risk assessment areas that you would have completed. And then finally over here, you can copy. Now the steps for copying the sample ISMS are a little bit more in depth, but that is all included on our FAQ page. And there's also an associated video to that as well. So with that said, we're just going to run through some of these key elements on our, we'll call it our homepage for today. The first one being your assess risk, and that's where you're going to go through and be able to view your individual assets, the groups, the types, and obviously then the associated risks with those areas. The next section that we will then cover will be the review control selections. This is an area that you may feel you want to pre-configure before starting your risk assessment, as that way each time you come to use a control, all of the relevant information, support and documentation will automatically be available to you instantaneously. The next tab along here is a dashboard. It's more of a form over function area, and it's just a nice tool that you may wish to use when you're in, say, a meeting with individual stakeholders or senior management, and it can also be exported into PDF and then shared with those relevant bodies if they haven't been able to attend these pre-scheduled meetings. Below there, we'll then have a print report section. We are going to have a brief look at that. We're not going to go into too much detail. Essentially, as we're software developers, I can't really explain in too much depth exactly what each one of the reports is trying to illustrate, but we will cover off which ones are available to you. And again, it is an area we'd suggest you having a play around with when it's in the sample company as opposed to going through yours. And then lastly on there is the settings menu. This isn't just changing fonts, colors and things like that. This is where you're going to be able to either create connections to a SQL server for multi-user use. You can modify your impact and likelihood scales in there. You can change admin rights and also user accounts as well. So as we started, as I just stated, we're going to go through the assess risk page. We're going to be building this completely on sample companies. We already have essentially a working ISMS built. It just needs to have its scorings placed next to each associated risk. So we'll just give this a moment to load, and it will open up a separate page entirely for us in just a second. So we'll make this full screen so it should be a little bit easier for you to read your side as well. So on the left-hand side here, this is our drop-down. At the moment, we're viewing our ISMS by the owner of a particular asset within our business. So the sample user at the top is there as a placeholder, and below each one of these, like so CIO, you'll have all of their associated assets. Now, what you can do here as well is, whilst you may have a group such as laptops or removable media, you may want to go into a bit more detail as opposed to you may have laptop 1, laptop 2, or laptop senior management. Each one may have its own individual associated risks as opposed to the group in general. To do that, you simply highlight the individual assets, so laptops as a whole, come up to the top here and then add a new asset, and it will create a new subgroup below there, and we'll show you how to do that in just a second. Along the top here, as I mentioned, we've got an area for user management. This will take you either into our settings menu, which we'll go into more detail later, so we're not going to cover that now. There is the ability to add a new asset, and that will be to either an existing group or to a particular owner, or as we view by different criteria, you can also amend it that way as well. We can delete an asset. Now, deleting an asset does also remove all of its associated risks. We'll then have our risk wizard, which is part of our new vsRisk 3.0 software, and that's what we're going to be showing you how to use today. We will at times occasionally bounce back to some more of the legacy points of vsRisk, in which some of you might be a bit more familiar with using some older versions of the platform. And then finally, dotted around the majority of the tool, you'll see these little question marks, and they'll just take you into help sections just to give you an idea as to what area or what is trying to be displayed in front of you at that particular point. So at the top here, as I said, we're viewing it by owner at the moment. You may find it easier or more streamlined if you view it by groups. So say you want to go through all of your building risks, then your sensitive information, intangible, and obviously these are all going to be specific to yourself if you're not using our sample company. Below there, you'll then have your assets at a very granular base level. You'll be able to view your assets in total. And then finally, if you're going to be viewing your risks by a particular scenario, this is where you'll be able to group those scenarios as well. So we're going to view it by owner for today, like so. So we'll drop back into here, and then we're going to run through our risk wizard as I mentioned at the beginning. So if we select on here, this will open up a new page for us, and then we'll cover off some of the key points you'll need to go through to set up your first risk, and then areas where you can even populate this as you're going through, as opposed to importing in bulk your own asset registers. Again, that's something we'll cover off later off as well. So the first tab we're going to come to, this is going to be seen as like a very familiar screen. Normally when you come to installing software, it could be like a next type thing. We've tried to mimic it based on there to try and speed up your overall risk assessment process. So the first one you're going to come to is asset. Now, all of these assets and everything you're seeing built into vsRisk is how you will receive it out of the tin, so to speak. So these will be available to you straight away. You can add to this if you want to, and you can either do that in here by clicking on the plus button to add a new asset, or if you've already got a pre-existing asset register through maybe an older Excel system that you were using beforehand, you can import that in bulk as well. So along here, we're going to choose something like laptops. Next to there, you'll have its type, so its hardware, its owner, CIO, and its classification, so confidential order 2. If you have additional information such as identification and location, that can be modified in here, and that can also be changed in your settings menu as well. Once we're happy with this selection, we then select next, and it will move us on into our threats and then subsequently the vulnerability as well. Again, all of the threats, vulnerabilities you can see on screen are all built in, and there are areas where you can customize these fields within the settings menu as well. So the one that we typically use when we're going through these presentations, training sessions, etc., is going to be illegal use of software. It's quite a common issue, and you'll find a lot of businesses nowadays really hunkering down on their admin rights to prevent this sort of thing happening. So we're going to use this as a very common option. At the top here, you do have a quick search box, which should help you navigate through this screen a little bit quicker as well if needs be. So once we've chosen our threat, we then need to associate a vulnerability with that as well. The one that we tend to use is going to be inadequate application control. As you may see, obviously, when you try to install something on your work laptop or work machine, you'll be blocked. It will say this is blocked by admin rights, and this is what we're going to be basing this particular scenario off of. So we're going to use inadequate application controls. And then next on here, we then need to go through and give its initial risk score based on the CAI, so confidentiality, availability, and integrity. The score grid for the sample company is slightly different to the one we created for our Vigilance software one a moment ago, where it's going to be based off a 5x3 grid with a very standardized range cutting directly across the middle of it as well. At this stage here, from our requirements within our settings menu, which again we'll cover, we've set it so that we can adjust each one of these individually. So at this point, you do have the option to toggle these on or off if you want to, and then that'll have a knock-on effect when you're coming into your residual risk area as well. So we're going to leave them all toggled on just to keep things nice and simple for this afternoon. And then to edit what this score is going to be, we just use the pencil icon over here, and it will point you directly at the risk score that you're then going to need to choose. So at this point, we're going to say that yes, based on our threat and vulnerability, we're going to say that everything is going to fall into an unacceptable area, and that's for all of the confidentiality, availability, and integrity systems here. So we're going to choose yes, 7 on all of these. Once we've made that option or made that choice, we can then move into what our response is going to be. Now, for people that are familiar with ISO 27000 or risk assessments in general, these is typically where you'd see treat, tolerate, transfer, and terminate, whereas in vsRisk, we slightly modify the naming of them, but there is a full description underneath each one as to what they're trying to outline. So for our scenario, we're going to choose modify. So we're actually going to choose to treat the risk internally by reducing or eliminating the risk's impact and likelihood by implementing additional cost-effective controls. So the comment here is going to be something very simple. We're just going to put it as improvement of UAC by the IT department. Obviously, this can be as in-depth or as brief as you want it to be. If, for example, you were going to be transferring this to an external IT company, you'd then use share as an example. So once we're happy with this choice, we then choose next. Now, if you recall when we created our own ISMS, we'd selected that we only want to be using the ISO 27001 control set. Now, when we come into controls on here, the sample company is allowed or does use access or has access to all of the available control sets. So typically what you'd see at this point is going to be a list of all of the PCI, CES, etc. But we've got the ISO 27001 just for now. If you do know the particular annex reference, or if you just want to quick search the particular name of a control, you can do so at the top here, or you can use the drop down next to each one of these to give you a better idea or description of what that control actually is. So the two we're going to be using is going to be our policies for information security. Again, these aren't going to be too exact or too relevant, but it's more just to show you there as a placeholder for now. We can add a number of different controls, so you're not restricted to recreating the same risk over and over again, just to show different controls that are going to be used in the overall scenario in this afternoon. So we're going to select next, and this will then take us into what our residual score is. So once we've put in place our response and our controls, what is now the after score going to be? So we're going to say, because each one of these has been marked at the initial risk stage, we then need to mark what they're going to be afterwards. So we're going to say that yes, now afterwards, it's all going to fall into a more acceptable area for all of the CAI scores that we need to input. So once we've done all this, we can then hit next, and then we need to choose who or what our risk owner is going to be. So whilst we have an asset owner as a CIO, we could then set the risk owner to be somebody else in our business. Maybe that could be head of web, head of HR, using the examples in front of us, or if you've got someone more specific in your own ISMS, and obviously you can choose from those as well. We're going to leave this as something nice and simple as our CIO, as essentially they're the asset owner as well. And then if we've got any additional comments, we can mark them in here and then illustrate whether they've been actioned yes or no at this point. Once we're happy with everything that we've done in here, we simply hit finish. This returns us back to the initial screen that we were looking at, the overall risk assessment page. And at this point, if we now expand upon CIO and navigate down to laptops, we'll then be able to see the one that we've just created. So we've got three, like I said, the sample company is built to a certain degree that haven't been scored. And then we've got one at the top here with a green mark saying that yes, the risk response is modifying, it is now within an acceptable criteria should this happen. So if we now select on this particular risk, this is going to be an area where you can modify over time without feeling the need to go through that risk wizard time and time again. And this will be something a bit more reminiscent for people on older versions of vsRisk as well. If you do want to jump back into the risk wizard, you just use the wizard icon here. We can use our edit button, which will open up a right-hand side attributes panel, which is how you used to create risks in the older 2.6 versions and before. And under here, you can go through, you can change the risk type, the threat, vulnerability, owners, and so on. Essentially everything you would have done to start off with within the risk wizard. Below here, you can then also modify the before treatment, so the scorings that we would have given it, the likelihood, the risk ratings, and then finally the response at the bottom as well. So we'll minimize this screen out of the way. You can use these options here again without even having to open up the right hand side attributes panel. So this is just another way to speed this entire process up if you're going to make a large change across the entire organization. Here, if you want to, we can just select this button. It will pull up another pop-up where we can again change whether you're choosing to treat, terminate, tolerate, or transfer the risk, and then finally that explanation below there as well. So we'll select OK. The last section on here that we're going to be covering is going to be the controls that you're going to be using. Now we can add more controls or we can remove them, or there's another area that we can move into as well. By double clicking on the control, this will take us into a separate screen specific to the control that we've just selected, not the risk necessarily itself. At the top here, we can mark whether the control has now been implemented, and if it hasn't, when is it due to be, or when is it planned to be put into place. We can add, again, more information associated to these particular controls as well. The vsRisk platform does have the ability to import the IT governance publishing toolkit for ISO 27001, and it will do that completely seamlessly. So this is why there are some placeholders in the system already. So where we've got sample information security policy, if you had that toolkit available to you, import in the zip file, then populates this with the relevant PDF documents if you need those as well. Now, there's two sections on here. The reason for that is on the left-hand side, that will give you a general supporting documentation for that control overall. So every time you come to use that particular control, regardless of what the risk is, what asset you're using it against, that information will be available to you at that point. If you want to upload documents that are very specific to this control implementation against this particular risk, you can then do so over here. So then that won't then cause any conflicts when you're using the control across any of the other risks within your business. So that is the risk assessment page. Again, if you've got any questions at this point, I'm just going to mark the time as 2:30 as to when we finish running through this area. So any questions I see before then, I'll just assume that they are related to this section. So we will now exit out of this page. Now, what you may notice as we go through, there's a lack of save buttons when we're on this main page, and that's purely because the system is automatically writing itself to its own database, be that whether it's stored on your own local laptop or hard drive, or onto the SQL server for all of the other multi-users to see it in action. So we're going to close out of here, and this will now return us back to this home page that we were looking at earlier on. The next area we're going to go through is going to be our review control selection. Now, the review control selection will give you access to all of the available control sets within vsRisk. So you'll have the ISO 27001, 2013 and 2005, and you'll also have things like PCI, CES, DSS, etc. So we'll make this full screen so it's a little bit easier to read. And we're going to mainly focus on ISO 27001, but below there you'll have a list of all of the available control sets, which will over time grow, obviously, depending on the demand and obviously updates of these particular controls. So we're going to choose the top one here, as this is one that we have just used within our risk assessment. So we can see that it's already been shown as a related risk to our illegal use of software due to inadequate application controls. This area is particularly handy if you know that you're going to be starting to pull a particular control out of circulation on your risk assessment. You will need to go into these individual risks, remove that control before you can mark whether it's excluded or not from the overall assessment itself. Along the top here, you'll have its reference, its name, and then description. You'll then have its reason for selection. So at the moment, we've got it simply in place because it is what we're basing our risk assessment on. Below there, again, you'll have excluded, which is greyed out for the time being, and that's purely because it's already in use against these related risks. And then finally, the last 5 options will be whether you're using that particular control for business, contractual, statutory, legal, or regulatory requirements, followed by a description as to the reason why that control is actually being used. The next section below there is an implementation detail box. So whilst we do have in the ISO 27001 toolkits available from IT governance, implementation guidance and requirements, you may want to input your own information as to how you're going to be doing that specifically within your own company or organization. And then below there, you've got that documentation that we were mentioning earlier on today as well. So as well as once you've created a risk and you're using that control and where you mark whether it's selected or planned, you could then also come into here and do a lot of the legwork to start with by pulling through any related documentation that you know is going to be needed or used across the risk assessment when you start within your business. So that is the ISO 27001. If we just look at a control set that we're not currently using in our risk assessment, you'll then be able to see where you can choose to whether it's excluded or not from your assessment. So the earlier version, the 2005, we can see that risk assessment isn't selected as it's not something we're considering, and then you can mark through and say whether it's excluded, and that's purely because we don't have any related risks. Something else you might be able to see that's wearing away on the screen is what the tool is trying to do is pull through similar controls. This is quite a handy tool, for example, if you're already going through ISO 27001, and you want to maybe start branching out into another area, maybe PCI, etc. This will just help you to start build that framework or that kind of spider's web. Say, okay, well, if we're already implementing this control, it's very similar to this one, so it should be easy enough to start becoming compliant or certified against that other control set as well. So it's just a nice way to help bridge the gap moving forward. So that is the control review selection. It is a bit of a snapshot area that we're going to have a look at, but it is just something to help you pre-configure your own controls and then obviously make that readily available as you move through your risk assessment. So we're going to close out of here. Again, there's no save buttons in there. It's continuously saving itself, so there's no need to worry of loss of data as we go through that screen. Now, the next tab we're going to is our dashboard. Now, the dashboard, as I mentioned, is completely form over function. It offers no input with the overall assessment itself. It's more as a presentation tool that you may wish to use within those specific board meetings and so on. So once this loads, it does take a little while to compile purely because it is pulling information from the sample company. But essentially what it will show up on screen in just a second is going to be things like pie charts, just to show basic implementation or planned events throughout your business, and then also your associated top risks as well. So we'll just give this a moment to load. Okay, so now that this has compiled itself, so as I mentioned a second ago, the majority of this is going to be just a top level view as to your overall risk assessment. So at the top left-hand side, you're going to have all of the risks that are currently being run through within the assessment itself. So we're going to say, yes, we've got 111 risks, and we want to view them by their rating. So we can see that the majority of them are going to fall into a not assessed area, and that's purely because the sample company has the risks in place, but they haven't had their score input against them. The very thin slither is the one that we've just created right now, and then we've got outside of acceptance criteria, and obviously that will become a lot more populated as you go through. Something you would have seen earlier on, we do again have these question marks just to give you a bit more of an introduction as to what that screen is trying to illustrate, and again that might be something quite handy to use when in those aforementioned meetings. Below there, you'll then have your control status. If you're using purely just the one, that's fine. Again, you'll have a drop down, so you can select all of the control statuses you're using, or just the ISO one that we're basing it on today. And you'll be able to see how many of them you're actually implementing, how many are selected, how many are planned, and how many are excluded or not yet chosen. The middle section here is going to give you a quick snapshot of the timeline. The sample company was created about 2 years ago, which is why a lot of them show that they're overdue right now, which is the red exclamation mark. And if you are using a multi-user platform, the user activity is quite a handy way to keep track as to which management have logged on, which risk assessments, risk assessors or risk owners have logged on to make changes within the past couple of months, years, or even minutes, as you can see here. Over here on the right hand side, you'll then have your risk response. So at the moment, we've only gone through and marked one that we're actually going to be treating, which is why the majority of the chart is green. So earlier on, where we saw modify, share, retain and avoid, we're now going to start reverting back to its proper terminology known within the ISO 27001 risk assessment space, and it's going to be the 4 T's, and then finally unknown if we haven't marked it. At the top here, you'll have an overall summary of the number of risks, how many of the controls you're going to be using, how many assets you have risks against within your business, how many asset owners you have, the number of risk owners, and then finally the number of the risks that we are treating. That middle section here that I just mentioned at the beginning is also where your top risks are going to be outlined. So this will show up to, I believe, 8 individual risks. Just to give, again, that very quick top level view to say, look, these are the main areas of concern within our business, and it's something we may need to work on in the future. Finally, on this page, you can export it into a PDF document, move it into a landscape option, and then export, and then that will allow you to share it with those relevant stakeholders as well. So we're going to come out of the dashboard now, and this will return us back to this area here. So the next tab we're going to go into is our reporting section. Now the reports that this can produce will be your statement of applicability, a risk treatment plan, a risk assessment report, risk summary report, comments report, and a control usage report. We're going to have a brief look at the statement of applicability. We're not going to go into too much detail on each individual one purely because the amount of time these do take a while to compile, and especially when we're trying to run the webinar at the same time, it might take a little while to populate. But within each one of these, they will have a number of different filtering options. So the statement of applicability is going to be allowing you to choose the individual control sets you're using. Along the bottom here, you can use the tool almost as a presentation tool in itself, so you can skip through individual pages and make it full screen if you want to. You do have the ability to export this into a PDF document. You can put it back into its original raw data, or alternatively export it into an Excel sheet if you wanted to then modify further on if you needed to at any point. So once this is finished, it will then give us a pretty standardized report that you should all be familiar with if need be. Just to run through some of the others, we're not going to open them as I just mentioned, but the risk treatment plan, the risk assessment reports, they'll give you areas where you can narrow down the particular asset owner or risk owner. You'll then be able to see maybe your control usage report to see how many of them are implemented, how many of them are overdue, and how many of them are currently planned to be put into place. So we'll just give this a couple more seconds to complete. And then one other thing just to note whilst this is loading, something you would have seen probably on the website is that the system has a way of keeping version numbers ready for you. So it's a nice way to keep a track of your auditing as you're going through. So along the top here, you'll be able to see the ISMS. So we're running off the sample company ISMS, but that would ordinarily read Vigilant Software if we were doing it off of there. Organization and so on. You'll then have when it was published, almost also right down to the second. It's version number. So each time you run a new report, that will go 1, 1.1, 1.2, and then finally who published it as well. What's quite handy on here is the way vsRisk handles the individual ISMS groups. So you may have, say I'm a consultant and I have company A, company B and company C that I'm running their ISMS controls or their risk assessments for. If I go into ISMS A, it will load up vsRisk as though it's its own platform again, go into all of its settings, run the reports. I could maybe on version 1.7 in that particular ISMS. Now I come back out, go into company B, run their statement of applicability, and they could be on maybe 1.9, and then obviously up and further we go. So they won't conflict, they won't keep building on top of each other. They do keep their own version numbers completely separate as well. If you do make any changes to the filters, all you need to simply do is just click the build report, and it will then whir away again to pull through all the relevant information based on what you've selected. So just to quickly go through the intro screen, on here you'll have the control that is currently being used, the objective, the control reference, title, description, and whether it's been applied, yes or no, over on the right hand side. So that is the reporting area. We will just have one more quick look. We could have a quick look at the risk treatment plan. That should have some information compiled within it. And again, this is just a way to illustrate that we can narrow down these filters to the risk owner, not just the asset owner, and then find its status, whether it's whether it's been planned, in place, or whether it's overdue. So we'll just give this a little while just to load again. I'll just give you a chance to ask any questions at this point. So I'm just going to make a note of the time, with it being 14:45. So any questions there should be related to the reports. Perfect. Okay, so now we're loading into this report. We'll just make a few modifications to it, and then we'll come out and move into the settings area where a lot of the modifications and your personalization of this can really be put into place. So the risk treatment plan, again, it's going to have its own separate version number to the statement of applicability, so they're not going to be conflicting in that manner at all. And then over here, like I said, we can change risk owner, so we can choose between the ones within our sample company, and then the status of those individual controls, whether they're planned, in place, or overdue. And then you'll get the read through down here, the target date, the status, and the response to that overall risk as well. So we will now come out of here, and we're going to go into the settings menu. Like I said, the settings menu isn't just a way to change fonts, things like that. It's a lot more in depth, and it will help you to try and reconfigure your overall ISMS as you start to progress year on year throughout your risk assessments as well. So the first tab that you come to will be System. I'm just going to make this full screen so it's a bit easier to see again. So the first tab you'll come to will be Systems, and this will look very familiar, as basically because we've already been through and created our ISMS this afternoon. So the first one is going to be acceptance criteria. So if you recall earlier, we went through and allowed additional criteria. We modified the range on here and so on. The next tab along is going to be your impact and likelihood scale. So the sample company, as I said, is working off a 3x5 grid, so simply unlikely, plausible, and likely, and then the operational days that is going to have an impact on our business with. These can be modified once you've already gone through your risk assessment, but what will happen is if you try to do that and toggle it on, it will ask you if you're sure, purely because if you make a change here, it will require you to go back through your entire risk assessment and make the modifications based on the new scoring system that you've input into the tool. So we're going to select no on here. The next area is that control set. So as I mentioned, this is where you can choose right from the very beginning, and over time, if you want to then start expanding your risk assessment, you can go through and select on here, and this will be the area that we're looking to build upon over the next couple of months within 2018. The next tab along is going to be your classifications. So if you recall when we were looking at laptop a moment ago, it had its own classification type, so whether it's private, restricted, confidential, etc. These can be modified if we want to, so simply select and edit. We can change the name of each one of these. We can add in our own custom ones, or we can remove it if we know that's not going to be a classification field type that we're going to be using over time. The next one is going to be type. So obviously we have our laptop seen as hardware, and obviously you'll have certain other areas such as your IP and so on that's going to fall into different types in your business. These can all be modified as well. Again, remember, this is only the sample company we're looking at, and this will be something you'll be building upon when you're working on your own ISMS your end as well. So the next tab along is our risk calculation. Now the risk calculation options that we have offered available to you is based on feedback that we've received from customers in the previous years when we've been working on building the platform, and also some of our consultants from our sister company IT Governance as well. So the ones that we have in here is going to be impact plus likelihood -1, impact plus likelihood, impact times likelihood, and so on and so forth. If you want to have a play around with these to begin with, you can do so by just choosing one here, and then then you'll have a small table at the bottom just to have a little play to see what the score is going to be and see if that's something you'd be happy to work with moving on. The next tab we come to is the requirements. So if you recall when we were going through the risk assessment and we could toggle on or off the individual confidentiality, integrity and availability, you can set it so that you just set an overall score and you are forced to give a score against each one of those by simply toggling this off. And there's obviously other additional requirements on here as well, such as assess residual risk on a per control basis, assess legal, contractual, regulatory requirements separately if you wish to as well. Again, like with the impact and likelihood scales, if you do make changes to this after you've already completed your risk assessment, you would be required to go back through and make those modifications, as essentially it will reset the ones that have already had in our example, the CIA worked on individually, so you'd have to go back through and group score them again. So the next tab we'll come to on here, and it's the last section under System, is where you can import toolkits. So if we select on here for now, you'll have all of the sample documents. You can open them. They are actually real PDF documents. They do exist. However, they are heavily watermarked, obviously, as you can appreciate, and a lot of them are just blanked out as well. If you do have that ISO 27001 toolkit, it's a very simple import. There's a zip file within that location. Just import the zip file and it seamlessly integrates itself directly into vsRisk for you. It doesn't require you to do any further dragging and dropping or associating them to the particular controls for you. So with that said, we're going to move into administration. Now, administration has two different purposes when you're looking at it from a standalone aspect all the way through to a multi-user aspect. The user system we're looking at now is a standalone version that we currently have installed. So what we see these people as is simply users of the tool or asset owners. So if we select now CIO, for example, we can see that we have an option to say, okay, this is going to be an actual user of our system. They're not just going to be seen as an asset owner or a risk owner. So we can toggle on their integrated security. So when they come to use vsRisk on their own machine, this is obviously more relating to multi-user. You can toggle them on and then it will just be a seamless login for them if they're using their supplied or provided work equipment. Below there, if you don't have the integrated security turned on, you can force the user to change their password on next login, and that's an automated thing. It's not something you have to prompt anywhere else in the system. You can then give them their full name, so you can either stick with the title or the title of their position, or alternatively you can put in an actual person's name if you wanted to. Below there, you'll then have their email address, which obviously is what's going to tie you into the Active Directory, allowing that integrated security. And then finally below there, you'll have what their role is within the business. Just to briefly explain these, administrator gives the person that we're working on, in this case CIO, it could be the sample user, CFO, etc. Administrator gives them absolutely full rights over every single part of your system. So all the way into the admin area that we're currently working on, the database area, synchronization, and every single risk that's being stored in vsRisk, they will have access to and have read-write abilities over. The next one below is asset owner. This locks them out of pretty much every single setting menu. All it allows them to do is go into the assess risk page and work on their associated assets, and then obviously give their scores and so on. The next one below is consultant. It gives them full admin rights over the entire system apart from the administration tab that we're currently working on at the moment. And then the bottom one here, it's quite an important one, is revoked. What revoked will do is it just blocks access to that individual to the system. So again, if you're a multi-user, you may have a CIO position that's in a transitional period. So one person's left and you're waiting for a new person to start. What you could do is simply revoke their access so they can't log in at all, whether it's remote or from their own machine. But what that will do is it will retain all of their associated assets, all of their associated risks. And once you then have that new person in that position, you simply add in their new email address and then change them back to whatever their last role status was, be that administrator, asset owner, etc. If you do delete an entire a user from this area, it will then remove all of those associated assets and risks, as I just mentioned. So we'll come out of user management now. What you'll also be able to see on here is obviously we're logged in as a sample user. It will just let us know the last logon details as well. And that will then go into a bit more detail when you move into the audit history. For me, it's not too much of an issue. It's only me working on it this afternoon. But if you are working in a bigger organization, you can see who's made what changes when they've last logged on, and so on and so forth. And if you want to just leave a quick comment next to each one, you could say maybe this was the weekly meeting that you have, just to leave a quick note to yourself. That's always encouraged in here as well. The next tab along on here is for your license. Now, this is quite a common question that we have from people through our support channels. If you're trying to move from one machine to another, which is quite common in businesses where maybe they're updating hardware and so on, maybe you're going from a desktop to a laptop, what you'd need to do here is simply copy your license before handing your laptop back, or have your IT team do this for you. Once you've copied the license, it will provide you with a small file. Keep track of that, put it onto a USB stick. When you then move it onto the new machine, you can then reinstall vsRisk, use that existing license, and it will then reinstall seamlessly. You don't need to worry about having to contact us or try and find another way to move your license across. So it will be a lot easier, obviously with different time zones as well, for you to do that yourselves. The next tab along is your database. So for the database here, ours is going to be grayed out, and that's purely because we're focusing on a standalone version. If you do have the network enabled or multi-user, as it's now known as, you'll be able to either update it along the top here, or alternatively go through assign the server location in this top area. You'll then be able to choose whether you're using Windows authentication or SQL authentication. You'll then be asked to enter in the username and password that you would have set up when creating the SQL connection, and then finally the location of the database itself. At the bottom here, you've got an area for the testing of that connection to ensure that the string is in place and works correctly. You'll have additional settings menus. You can reset any of the information you've created above, and then also save this information as well. Now, with regards to support when it comes to multi-user, we will do everything we can to obviously assist you in obviously showing what information you do need to have. Ultimately, it is something we strongly encourage yourselves to have your own network team or your own IT department set up for you, as essentially each and every person's SQL servers can be configured differently, and we can end up going down quite large rabbit holes until eventually we find the root cause. So we would always suggest a network administrator to set this up for you, and if needs be, we can always have a development team member available from our side, and they should be able to deep dive a little bit further if we do get to that point further on down the line. So moving on to the next tab on here is where you're going to start pulling something from an older system you're using, maybe an Excel spreadsheet system you were using, into vsRisk, making it almost a carry-on step as opposed to starting over and over again. This is where you'll be able to import assets, so providing that your name, type, location, identification, classification, and owner are these headers in your Excel document. You can save an Excel template from vsRisk and then simply copy and paste the relevant information across. It will then import seamlessly. The only time it will fail to import itself or import an external document is if these have not already been added into vsRisk. So you need to ensure, maybe if you're saying you've got a location in, I don't know, Botswana or just somewhere anywhere in the world, you do need to ensure that that location is already available within vsRisk, and that goes for the same as type, classification, and owners, etc. The next option on here is the ability to export assets. Now, we do find people that are brand new to the whole risk assessment scene. What they can do is export our pre-created one. You may then want to modify this inside an Excel document, maybe change classification types, or even add in your own additional information such as specific locations, identifications, etc., and then re-import. That's another way you can speed that all up, as well as keeping an external copy of this on your own system as well. The next tab along is backup and restore. Doesn't really need too much of an introduction, but this is quite strongly advised. Again, if you're moving from one machine to another, you can simply move the backup, and that way you can continue on with your overall project. These last three areas are something that we do find customers using more and more nowadays, as obviously threats and vulnerabilities are becoming more and more specific to an individual organization. Now, unlike the asset screen, you can't import these in bulk from an existing Excel spreadsheet. This is a manual process, so you would be required to enter these in manually each time. You do so by selecting the plus button at the top left-hand corner. It opens up a new box here, and we just double-click, enter in the title of that threat and then its description. And that will be exactly the same for vulnerabilities, like so. Using the plus button, we can enter that in there. And then finally on controls, there's a very slight difference on here. And by that, I mean at the moment, we can see that these are sorted by their ISO groups or their particular annexes or control sets. What will happen is when you select on plus here, it will automatically name your framework as ISM, but the next box is then editable. So you can start putting in your own reference codes that you use internally as well, followed by its title and then description. What you can then do is make the ISM that you've created an available control set, so you can start to integrate it into an existing risk assessment as well. The next tab along on here is synchronization. Synchronisation is starting to integrate more and more with our CyberComply portal. CyberComply is another part of Vigilance Software's portfolio where we store more things to do with like GDPR and compliance. What this does is it essentially pulls through the ISO 27001 control set to ensure that the controls are kept up to date, as essentially CyberComply is where we store the information, and this is why vsRisk does need to retain a constant internet connection in case you are using the API keys for CyberComply. It's a completely free of charge area. There's no cost implications at all. It's very quick and easy to set up. You simply enter in the relevant information. You'll be emailed with the API. You only need to link it once. You may need to link it again, obviously, if you do a reinstall, but once you've done it the first time, it's set in stone. It doesn't need to be adjusted after that point. The very last tab on here is help. This will just give you the version numbers. This area is something we may occasionally ask users to refer to if they're experiencing an issue with a particular part of the system. We may need to know a version number to see if there's a newer version available to them, or alternatively, if there's a workaround or an actual fix that we can offer there and then based on that particular build. And then lastly over here we have support. We've got a help and support section, FAQs, webinars, patches, updates, etc. And that has just gone through a recent overhaul over the past couple of months where there's going to be video tutorials available to you now for things like showing you where to find certain folder locations. It will also show you things like how to copy the sample company that we went through a little bit earlier as well. And then finally, just below there, you'll have our contact information. You're more than welcome to contact us at any point. You can either call us or drop us an email. We do have a proper support system, so we do have a ticketing system in line, and we do encourage all of our users to use that method, as essentially our development team has full visibility over that, as opposed to a direct message to any of the support staff here, either myself, Amy, or any of the other team on the Vigilance Software panel. So that brings us to the end of vsRisk. Now there is something I'm going to show some of you from your side, as essentially is something that does crop up once in a while. If you do ever need to reinstall vsRisk for whatever reason, or we ask for a log file or a database from you to either correct a corrupt file or anything like that, this is something I need to illustrate to you, so it is something you might want to keep track of. The webinars are recorded, so this will be made available to you after the presentation as well. If we ever have to come back to you and ask for a log file or the database, be that for a multi-user setup, obviously that'll be on an SQL server, but for if you're seeing a corruption in your own file, simply select the start button at the bottom, navigate into a folder location, so we've already tagged ours on the bottom. This will open up File Explorer. Now on here, you'll then need to navigate to this PC, and you'll then have your local disk where you're storing, or your main C drive on your machine. Double click on here, and ordinarily you'll have these at the top here, but you won't be able to see program data, as that is essentially a hidden folder as set by standard within Windows 7 and Windows 10. You'd need to go to View, and then this drop down here gives you an option to view hidden items. So if we deselect that, program data disappears. And if we select it again, you'll then have program data highlights. So again, like I said, it is hidden by standard. Do not confuse it with program files. That information that we're going to require from you is not held in there. That's simply the install file itself, not the database. So we select on program data. There will then be the aptly named folder known as Vigilance Software, and it should also show you obviously when it was last modified. So we did a reinstall just before the demo this afternoon. And then in here, you'll see vsRisk. And then finally, at this point, this is where we would start to need information from you if you're experiencing issues. So we would need a copy of this file here, not the pre-upgrade, the one at the very bottom, which is your database. The one above there is your license. So again, if you want to be a bit more proactive, you can just copy this file, and then when you reinstall, just import it into the folder location, and it should then allow vsRisk to launch. But the other one we may need occasionally is a log file, and this is just a basic text file that allows us to view any sort of error reports that this is kicking out in the backside. So debugging makes debugging a lot quicker for us to try and ascertain what's caused the overall issue to start with. So I just wanted to make that quite clear from the beginning, but this video is also available on the FAQ page as well. So we'll close out of here and we'll return back to our vsRisk platform here. We're just going to go through and just ensure that we have covered off all of the points on our presentation. So we've gone through ISMS creation, explained what it is, it defines the bounds of the risk assessment. I explained that we do have the ability for multiple ISMSs, and it does come packaged with the sample ISMS, which is what we worked on throughout the presentation. The next one was the risk assessment. So just to recap on there, vsRisk is built to deliver simple, fast, accurate, and hassle-free risk assessments. As you saw, that risk wizard really does speed things up, and it allows you to keep things consistent, robust, and reliable year after year, allowing you to modify your own scales and ranges as well. The key versions of version 3, the key features of version 3, we did cover them as we went through the presentation. It now gives you custom acceptance criteria, which is where we toggled on the disaster area and then modified its range. The risk assessment wizard, which is what we went through. The control set synchronization, that's where it ties into our cyber comply portal. And then the risk assessment at a glance was that dashboard that you may wish to share with your senior management or stakeholders in those particular board meetings. The control reviews was the area that we went through, and you could see things like similar controls. You could mark whether you're using the control for regulatory, statutory requirements, and all data entered into the controls view is incorporated into the statement of applicability as well. So it saves you having to modify that report later on down the line as well. The reports and dashboard. So whilst we had a quick brief look at that, it did give you the option for 6 of the reports. They can all be exported from vsRisk directly into PDF. They can be exported into Excel and XPS as well. Raw data is available, and also that they can be printed directly from the system as well. And we are now in the Q&A section of it. So thank you very much for your time and obviously patience whilst we went through that area. We do have a couple of questions, I believe, over here. Now, I will do my best to answer the ones that we've got. If we've got some that's a little bit more in depth, we may need to come back to you after the presentation once we've discussed with anybody else. With our consultants or development team. So what other control sets are due and when for GDPR? GDPR doesn't necessarily have a control set, as essentially it's a regulation and not a control set that you'd run a risk assessment against. There are, I believe, ISO sets that are starting to be tailored more towards GDPR, but again, coming from a development standpoint, not necessarily a consultant's background, I possibly wouldn't be the best person to answer that for you, Charlie. Cloud version is looking to be towards the end of 2018. Is something we really are excited to try and get up and running as quickly as possible, as it does make integration a lot simpler and a lot quicker for users to get started. When we get a link to the video should be sent out to you. It's normally 24 to 48 hours after the presentation, so when this is stopped, the recording will be published and then refined and then made available to everyone that's attended and also the people that haven't. Can vsRisk link to policy documents in SharePoint rather than importing a copy? Rex, I'm not 100% sure. As far as I'm aware, I'm assuming if you're wanting to link to a policy document, you're just wanting to enter in a URL. I can't imagine that being a problem, but I will just get that confirmed before saying yes or no, if that's okay. Can you integrate ISO 27005 into vsRisk? All of the control sets that are on there, Michael, are the ones that come built into the system. We will be looking to expand into that more when it goes into the cloud version, as cyber comply is essentially where we're going to be storing more and more of the controls. But at the moment, no, 27005 isn't in there. What you can do as a makeshift workaround for now is you can manually enter those in under the controls area, where you could manually input your own information and use the ISM areas, that ISO 27005, if you wanted to. Gordon Smith, where do you threat and vulnerabilities come from, i.e. 27,005. I'm not 100% sure on that, Gordon. I can find that out for you and come back to you via email if that's okay. And Michael Sim, last one, what's Compliance Manager? Compliance Manager and the data flow mapping tool is the other part of our product lineup. So we've got vsRisk, which is obviously for risk assessment. The Compliance Manager is where we store all of the statutory and legal requirements. So it's actually the host to the entire regulation piece for EU GDPR as well as UK laws. And again, that's going to be expanding depending on demand from our current customer base. And then the data flow mapping tool is where you can simplify the Article 30 part of GDPR as well to obviously illustrate where you're storing data and how it transfers throughout your business. So Compliance Manager, just to recap, is where we store the ISO controls, and it's also where vsRisk ties into for now to pull through that information. Yes, Michael. So just to recap on what I just mentioned, that API key is where it links into the Compliance Manager. So at the moment, it is only done via API, where it would pull through the updates manually or automatically, I suppose, in the background for you. But when we do start to migrate over into the cloud, they'll then have a lot more integration between the two. But until that goes into a bit more of the later testing stages, we can't really mention or really discuss too much more about it at the moment. Okay, that seems to be okay. Aaron, does this software work with session host server? As far as I'm aware, it does. I will just confirm that for you. I think we've got a message or a message thread open with you already, Aaron. So what I'll do is I'll come back to you directly through there just to confirm whether that will work or not for you. Gordon Smith, yes, sorry. With regards to these training webinars, typically they're sent out to people that already own the product. If you are looking to purchase the product or wanting to know about costs for the cloud version, we don't have the cloud version costs available at the moment. That's still going through the relevant bodies within our department. With regards to the costs as they stand at the moment, for vsRisk standalone, so that's one person that has access to the tool, these are lifetime licenses. Bear in mind, this will be £1,495 plus VAT, obviously depending on where you are in the world. And then you'll have an annual support contract that goes with that, which will be charged at £300 on top per annum, and that will include all of the updates and all of the support that goes along with that product. With the multi-user version, which is the one where it will be stored on a central database, and then all of the clients, you'll have up to 10 client installs that you can use. That will then be £2,995 plus £600 for the support. Obviously, we need to try and we need to also understand that there could potentially be more points of contact from a particular business. Okay. Will Brexit affect your services? No, from our standpoint, we're not seeing any issues with that. If you want to, Michael, I can contact you directly to see, obviously, if you've got any further follow-up questions with that. But at the moment, I can't see it affecting our services as of yet. But I can find out from our legal team or our compliance manager if there will be any sort of input or any detriment to our business or services. Hugh Gallagher, how up to date is the threats catalogue, and typically how much more should be put into this in settings? With regards to the threats and vulnerabilities, they are as up to date as version 3, so that went live, I believe, second quarter of 2017, maybe a little bit earlier than that. So that's when the threats and vulnerabilities were last updated, as that's when the sample company was last touched. Any updates that have been pushed out to the tool since then have been incremental pieces to the software itself. So when any threats and vulnerabilities are maybe encouraged or updated, we will push them through via the API key. But also, as you can see, there is an area for you to modify that as well. Yes, Gordon, you can expand beyond the 10 users. The pricing is all on our site. Off the top of my head, it depends on the number of users and obviously how big the initial order would be to see if there'd be any workaround or any further offerings that we could give you. But yes, you can expand beyond the 10. That isn't simply a restriction. It's just to do the licensing on the product itself. Okay, not a problem, Michael. Okay, I can't see that anybody else is typing at the moment. What we'll do is, obviously, the webinar will remain open until 3:30, which is the advertised time for the presentation. I will remain at my desk. What I'll do is I'll pop myself on mute so you don't get the background noise from our office, and whilst we're waiting for people to ask questions, anything that does come through that I've been unable to answer, as I mentioned, we'll go through to the relevant teams here at Vigilant Software and ensure you do get an accurate answer based on what you've been popping in the question boxes. Again, thank you very much all for your time this afternoon. I hope it has given you some form of insight into the tool and help you have a better understanding as to what the tool can do for you, as well as what Vigilant Software is as a company and what we can do to assist you to become either certified against ISO, or if you're looking to move into our other products, become more and more compliant with the upcoming GDPR and other regulations. But again, thank you very much for your time. Have a lovely evening. If you're in the UK, enjoy the beautiful blue skies, and we'll be in touch shortly. Thank you.